Yes, hello, John. It is a pleasure to have you here with me again to have a chat about evolution. And we have agreed beforehand to have this conversation. And I would like to show you what I have investigated in regards of that topic. You can explain what you think explains biodiversity and complexity. And eventually, if you think we can go into also common ancestry, I think these are the two points which are disputed amongst evolutionists and creationists. And I think that adaptation or microevolution, that is something that there is usually no disagreement. So I think that is not something that uh, uh, is a relevant topic at this moment. But what we want to have a chat about is what best explains biodiversity, if it is unguided evolution or intelligent design and creation. So as a first introduction, I will put a video which I made. It's short, about 11 minutes, which points out the main points which I think are the main contributors to evolution, actually to biodiversity.
Okay.
The question of where life, biodiversity, and organismal complexity came from has always been one of the fundamental existential questions of humanity, and is today covered in modern science by evolutionary biology. The question if Darwin's theory is a fact is as well a core question in the evolution-creation debate. Some atheists regard evolution as one of the main reasons to discard creationism, and as a consequence, theism is viewed with skepticism and incredulity. In 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species, which has become the foundation of modern biological sciences until today. In 1942, Julian Huxley, a British evolutionary biologist, published the book Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, which was a fusion of various disciplines like genetics, covered by population genetics, experimental genetics and systematics, paleontology, botany, and so on. The modern synthesis went gradually through further improvements, and the more recent version was a new conceptual framework proposed in 2007 by Massimo Pigliucci and Gerd Müller in their book Extended Evolutionary Synthesis. They incorporated new information from molecular genetics and genomics, describing new kinds of hereditary and replicatory mechanisms which were not considered within the framework of the previous versions. Many books have been written over the years with the purpose to disprove Darwin's theory, and many pointing out successfully why his theory does not withstand scrutiny. The number of scientists of various biological disciplines and biochemistry who disagree has grown into the thousands. One group declared, "We are skeptical of claims of the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life." The claim of the standard theory is that a rather small toolkit of genetic modifications during long periods of time based on random genetic errors explains the rise of genetic modification and new information, and as a result, the enormous range of biodiversity proposing mutations and natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, and artificial breeding by human intervention as why these sense are modified. In 2017, Gerd Müller, theoretical biologist, stated, "Biological sciences have made significant advances in the last decades, providing a wealth of new knowledge about the factors responsible for organismal development processes. The modern synthesis and its various additions concentrate on genetic and adaptive variation in populations. Extended framework emphasizes the role of epigenetic processes, ecological interactions, and systems dynamics in the make of organismal complexity. Single level and unilinear causation is replaced by multi-level and reciprocal causation. Among other consequences, the extended framework overcomes many of the limitations of traditional gene-centric explanations. Several of the cornerstones of the traditional evolutionary framework need to be revised and new components incorporated into a common theoretical structure. Gerd Miller is part of a group of scientists which propose an alternative to the standard evolutionary model, called the third way. Remarkably, in their opening statement, they say that creationism depends upon intervention by a divine creator. That is clearly unscientific because it brings an arbitrary supernatural force into the evolution process. First of all, it has not been established beyond any doubt that naturalistic evolutionary processes account for biodiversity. Scientific investigation should permit the evidence to lead wherever it is, without excluding intelligent causation a priori. Excluding one possible answer, namely intelligent design, means committing the same philosophical error as back in the 19th century with the X Club and Darwin's old dog Thomas Huxley, when they did the same. An important distinction is made between micro and macroevolution. The common claim is that small changes lead over time period of billions of years to big changes, and small variations permit the rising of new biological structures and functions and levels of complexity, from a universal common ancestor to all forms of life. This claim, however, has never been shown to be true. It's a common assertion, even held today by the majority of biologists, that microevolution leads to macroevolution. The article in Nature magazine, for example, claims in its conclusion remarks, Darwin's proposal merits further consideration as a viable link between microevolution and macroevolution. Let's clarify. Organisms can and do adapt to the environment, which is often described as microevolution, but would be better described as adaptation. It is life essential and had to be fully set up when life began. Natural selection on the limited scale is a fact, but even in regards to adaptation or microevolution, not the main driving mechanism that explains it. The main dispute is the claim that all organisms descend from a universal common ancestor, and the idea that unguided, unintelligent natural processes explain biodiversity. In his book, Darwin suggests that all living organisms are related by ascendancy, and therefore they are all derived from ancestral species, which migrate around the world and diversify, generating the amazing biodiversity of organisms. Variational plasticity and adaptation, which are mentioned in points 1 to 5, are empirically demonstrated facts. What is in dispute, however, are points 6 and 7, universal common ancestry and macroevolution. The claim that all biodiversity is explained by unguided, unintelligent, purposeless natural processes without intelligence involved. There are various aspects and ways of how we can analyze evolution, like for example doing comparative anatomy, systematic classification of life, and elaboration of the supposed phylogenetic tree of life. Then there is the analysis of the fossil record by paleontologists and the attempt to establish a line of transitional fossils demonstrating evolution, variation in population genetics, quantitative genetics, how it is modified under certain selection regimes. And another aspect is the investigation of how organisms acquire more and more complexity, the emergence of varied body plans, architectures, physiology, and functions. And there is the aspect and question of evo-devo, of developmental biology, that compares the developmental processes of different organisms to infer the ancestral relationships between them and how developmental processes supposedly evolved. And last but not least, the origin of consciousness, mind, logic, speech, languages, covered by anthropology, linguistics, and social sciences. Before we can ask about the mechanisms and the origin and the maintenance of body plans, we need to ask what is currently responsible for the development of complex multicellularity and organismal architecture, form, and cell shape. We need to understand how an organism develops to adulthood, which permits us, with that framework, as a starting point to do top-down research to understand how the responsible toolkit and rules for organismal complexity could have emerged in the past. In fact, it is a development program which sets how a multicellular organism develops. So we have to define what that development program consists of in order to know what has to change for an organism.
Otangelo, are you still there?
It stopped. I don't.
To change its physiology and complexity.
Oh, there we go. Sorry.
So that change of the development program is what would have to change for an organism to change. And that has given rise to very varied programs of evolutionary disciplines and research programs. It has become more and more evidently clear that a varied multitude of different mechanisms is responsible for body constructions, which are not limited to genetics, but mainly, if not even more important, epigenetic factors. And not only on an intracellular level, but physiology on a multi-layered level, which is investigated in systems biology. The real mechanisms that explain biodiversity and complex organismal architecture is pre-programmed instructional complex information encoded in various genetic and epigenetic languages and communication by various signaling codes through various signaling networks. That brings us to the origin of all life forms by an intelligent designer.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. That was it?
Yes.
Okay. So I mean, all of the papers that you had sent me, and even in your presentation there, I mean, I really don't see the need to propose a creator god. I don't see the need to propose a creator god in order to account for the biodiversity that we have here.
The basic unit of all living tissue. In most human cells, there is a...
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
so, I mean, like, for instance, you think that there's a distinct difference between macro and micro evolution, right? Like, you don't think that so what's your, because I mean, it was kind of a long video. It's kind of hard for me to respond to the entire video.
Yeah.
But why specifically do you think that a long period of quote unquote micro evolution can't turn into the macro evolution that we see now?
Okay, adaptation, John, is a fact, and that is not disputed by any one of us. Now,
Right.
Adaptation requires different mechanisms on a molecular level, like heat shock proteins, and this is a process which has to be pre-programmed from the beginning. If cells and life cannot adapt to the environment, then even the first living cell, the first living self-replicating cell, would die, because this is a requirement of life, that it can adapt to the environment. And there is a speciation on the second degree, which is known as a fact as well when organisms diversify to even a point where they cannot interbreed anymore. But this is not a speciation on a primary level, where you have features which arise, which give rise to more complex organismal structures and body form, like the making of ears and eyes and legs and arms, and the shell of turtles and the wings of birds, and so forth. That is primary as a speciation which has not been observed to be able to occur. And the prime example is Lenski's experiment with bacteria. And I think they are at 70,000 generations now, and they have not been able to observe any change on a macro level which would give rise to a bacteria with a different organismal structure.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning of what you had said there, because you had said that it has to be pre-programmed. What is your evidence for the idea that it has to be pre-programmed by some intelligence in order for that to exist?
Okay, in order to have the first life form which has to be able to adapt, we have a threshold, what would be the smallest living organism, which are bacteria. And usually it has been claimed that Mycoplasma genitalum would be the smallest life form known, which has about 500,000 nucleotides. The problem, however, is that Mycoplasma is a pathogen which requires a host in order to be able to get its nutrition. And of course, that was not extant on a prebiotic Earth. There was no host there which it could have its nutrition. And it doesn't produce the 20 amino acids which are used and required to make proteins. So that is not an example for a smallest self-replicating free living cell.
Well,
okay.
So hold on. I feel like the big mistake that you're making there is assuming that particular organism it was one of the first life forms that formed. I mean, the official the official scientific position on this would be that life started to form on Earth, and that would come after. I'm more convinced by an RNA world, the RNA world kind of hypothesis, which newer scientific advancements that I'm not aware of obviously could persuade me to a different position, but I feel like, RNA developing first and then being self-replicating and then eventually developing into these prokaryotic organisms that we just simply don't know anything about now. And then those prokaryotic organisms changing with the environment because of the fact that they are chemically based, and the DNA is a chemical that reacts with chemicals, and they go through these processes. And, I think that DNA being able to adapt and change to the environment, I think that whole process is just kind of inherent to the, chemical nature of DNA.
Okay, first of all, we would have to establish what is life. When is the threshold reached where we can say this is just lifeless biochemistry and this is where life starts? And Paul Davies has written a book, The Fifth Miracle, and he points out these things which would have there in order to say, okay, this is where life starts. And he mentions reproduction, metabolism, homeostasis, nutrition, complexity, organization, growth and development, information content, hardware, software entanglement, permanence, and change.
Okay, see, I have a lot of issues with this particular list. At least because I think, isn't Paul Davies a creationist?
No.
Oh, he's not?
No.
Okay, sorry. The Paul Davies rings a bell, and I couldn't remember which side he fell on. But in any case, because the hardware software entanglement, I feel like you're taking that as like, because I got hints of this in both your opening and in other interactions, that you consider DNA to be a literal like language and literal software. So I guess I feel like with this particular list, I feel like you would go in directions that maybe like Paul Davies necessarily wouldn't have intended. So I mean, I'm perfectly fine with the general scientific idea of this being able to determine if something is alive. I really wasn't drilling down into like what is alive and what isn't. Obviously, the RNA that was self-replicating that preceded life on Earth, I wouldn't consider being alive. That's still non-organic, or maybe not non-organic, but non-living chemistry interacting. And then at some point it would have developed into a single-celled prokaryotic organism. Or maybe there was I know there's the there's prokaryotic, eukaryotic, and archaea.
Archaea, yes.
Yeah. So
of life.
Yeah, I'm a little fuzzy on the archaea, as far as if it developed prior to prokaryotes. But in any case, what you're going to have is a single-celled life that develops, that's incredibly simple, and it most likely doesn't exist today. Like the first life most likely doesn't exist today. So just knowing how natural environments form this sort of, I guess, homeostasis, to take a word from Paul Davies there. Environments try to reach an equilibrium, right? If there's something that's out of the equilibrium, right? If it's an environment that's not in this equilibrium, things change in order to seek that equilibrium. Not like seek as in intelligently seek, but just the natural flow of things is to reach an equilibrium, right? Yes. And so that's, I mean, that explanation right there covers why DNA adapts, why things change in DNA, and along with, the random mutations that happen and everything like that. All of that explains how we can go from a single-celled organism to the complex life that we have today.
Okay, you said that you think that the first life forms were simple. Now, I will read here. What might be the cell's minimal requirement of parts? And new evidence suggests that the last universal common ancestor was a sophisticated organism after all, with a complex structure recognizable as a cell, researchers report. Their study appears in the journal Biology Direct. The study lends support to a hypothesis that Luca may have been more complex even than the simplest organisms alive today, says James Whitfield, a professor of entomology at Illinois and the co-author of the study. So that would actually disprove what you say, that it would be a simple form, because you need a certain number of structures and proteins in order to keep the basic life forms, life functions, which are absolutely necessary. As I listed before, I listed them, and I think Paul Davies, he made a nice list of it. I think these are functions which are required to recognize what is life.
Okay. So I really don't think that the thing that you brought up disproves what I've said, primarily because regardless of how complex the first single-celled organism was, it still came about naturally through natural means because of how the laws of chemistry dictate, how things interact. So regardless of how complex it was, however many proteins that it needed to generate or anything like that, it would have came together and it would have developed in an environment where it could survive. So you saying that, it can't produce these proteins or it can't produce the minimal amount of proteins that we have for life today does not really say anything about this first organism and the environment that it was in, because it obviously developed naturally, and it obviously developed in a way that it could survive in the environment that it was in. And then when the environment changed, it changed because of the fact that, you know, it was you know, out of that equilibrium where, you know, it could survive and propagate. And so it either had to change or die off. And that's exactly what we see in nature now. If an organism cannot adapt to its environment, or like if it chooses to stay in an environment that it cannot adapt to, then it will die off, right? Or it can change its environment either by moving physically or by actually manipulating the environment, which would be, you know, indicative of what we do. But not only what we do, but like beavers, they also do it. There are plenty of organisms on this planet that manipulate their environment so that they can survive better. So, I mean, these are the various ways in which the environment changes so that it can reach this equilibrium of survival, right? So, I mean, nothing, just basically nothing that you said has actually disproven the idea that the single-celled organism could have come into existence. Just because something's complex does not mean that it needs an intelligent designer in order to snap it into existence. You know, we have natural things now that are plenty complex, but happen. They happen naturally without any kind of supernatural intervention. I'm kind of curious how do you explain things now operating naturally without supernatural intervention?
Well, as I said previously, John, I think that God, he created all kinds of life, all species of life in the beginning with the capacity to adapt to the environment and to speciate, and then let them do to their own, to replicate and go on. So I don't think that God is constantly intervening in nature to do things. I think he made everything ready in order to be able to self-sustain, be self-sustainable, and to keep life going. Now, I would like to come back to a point which you made, that you said that you think that physical necessity eventually could explain the origin of life. And I have an article on my library which asks the question, what are the possible mechanisms to explain the origin of life? And the problem with physical necessity, John, is following. I would like to read here. The nucleotide sequence of DNA and RNA have an instructional function to make proteins and is not random, but complex and specified, and not due to physical necessity or physical laws. And this is what events in a prebiotic land would need to produce, a minimal set of proteins. And this kind of specification does not arise through chemical reactions. The result of a chemical reaction is not random, but the events dealing with an eventual chemical reaction would have been in there was not a mind guiding the events. So what?
So let me interrupt real quick, because I mean, basically we have this concept of the minimal set of proteins that's required for life, right?
Yes.
But I don't think that you can directly say that is what's necessary for any life to develop. That's how we experience life now. That's the minimal set of proteins for life to operate now, or to operate in the most effective way for survival. But I really don't think that you can make that large leap to saying that is what is required for life, full stop. Like that's how many you need. But even if you were to take it as that's how many that you need, it still could have and most likely did develop naturally, and most probably did develop naturally. Your little selection here goes on to say that this kind of specification does not arise through chemical reactions. What evidence do you have to say this? I really disagree with the idea that chemical reactions cannot produce other chemical reactions, or that they cannot produce some kind of other sets of chemicals that then go on to interact in a different way. And evolutionary theory would say that while these chemical reactions were random and everything like that, there would have been a certain sequence of events that happened that seemed to be the best, like for whatever chemical to survive in that environment, for it to remain around. Evolutionary theory would say that started forming, that started happening, those things started building, right? And it eventually got to the point where life started to form. And so regardless of how many amino acids you think need to be created in order for life to form, while it's unlikely and the probability is small, like extremely small, the fact that you have so many chemical reactions happening, like in that amount, like in however long, like a billion, maybe not a billion years, but 500 million years, right? That amount of time and that amount of chemical reactions happening, it will definitely happen. Like it's 100% probability that it will happen. It just won't happen quite often. But once it does start happening, then it starts happening again and again and again and again. So it continuously starts happening, and then you end up with this environment where that is the norm. That's the equilibrium of that environment, is that life starts to develop. So, I mean, that's I totally disagree with the assertion that that it's impossible for chemical reactions and the natural world to be able to produce a specific set of events to occur. Just probabilistically speaking, it's definitely 100% going to happen.
Okay, 2 points here, John. If we take as a minimal free-living bacteria, I suggest Pelagibacter ubique, which is one of the smallest free-living organisms, and it has 1.3 million base pairs. So it's significantly bigger than Mycoplasma, and it generates all the 20 amino acids which are required to make the proteins. And I've put it here on the screen. And the chance to have a genome of this size by unguided random events, you cannot invoke evolution, because evolution started only with DNA replication. And the chance to have that sized genome would be 10 to the 700,000. So this is
that zero?
Yes, that's 10 to the 7. Well, if you have a threshold of 10 to the 50 of the power, that would be, by Borel's law, mean that this chance is basically a zero that it would happen by unguided random events. And
no. See, you're forcing the position to become zero. That's not the same thing as it literally being zero. Just because it's a small probability does not mean that it is effectively zero. Can you how prevalent do you think chemical reactions are just happening naturally?
Well, the thing is, John, after I finish this argument, then the question, of course, is if there is even a possibility that molecules randomly laying around on a prebiotic Earth, rather than self-integrate, would complexify. And this is a big problem in abiogenesis research, because the evidence demonstrates that molecules, they become asphalt, and that has been proven over and over. And I can cite to a paper from Steve Benner, which he released in 2012, where he makes specifically that point. And he points out that this is one of the paradoxes of the origin of life.
Well, see, here's the problem, though, is that we're supposed to be talking about evolution, and you're still focusing on abiogenesis, which I'll agree. I'm not an expert at abiogenesis. I know very minimal amount of information about the scientific evidence for abiogenesis. But what I do know is that abiogenesis is a chemical reaction. And because we have similar chemical reactions happening now, it most definitely happened naturally without the need for a creator God. So it still seems like you're using like large numbers in order to suggest, well, large or small numbers in order to suggest that somehow somehow it makes it impossible to happen, or it definitely won't happen. And that's just, that's just simply not the case. I feel like if you had really any kind of education in probability or statistics, you would understand that unless the actual value is 0%, or there is something that prevents it from happening to where you would have a probability of 0% it happening, then you definitely have a chance for it to happen. And with given enough time and enough chemical reactions happening, it will 100% happen.
Well, first of all, 0%, John, is 0. And 0, of course, is equivalent to nothing, and nothing has no causal powers. But besides that, I would like to come back to the argument which I made in regards of disintegration of molecules. And
okay. Before you begin with that, can we address this last point and then actually talk about evolution?
Okay. So there are 10 to the 80th power of atoms in the entire universe, and the chance to have a minimal genome with 1.3 million nucleotides is 1 to 10 to the 700,000. So to go from 10 to the 80, which is the number of atoms in the universe, to 10 to the 700,000, we are talking of a number which is hugely bigger than 10 to the 80. And still to state, oh, that is still a possibility that it could happen, that's simply not true in my understanding, John.
Well, I mean, I feel like you're just exposing your ignorance of statistical probability. I mean, it's not a matter of how many atoms there are in the universe. It's a matter of how many chemical reactions are happening in a certain time frame. And for the time frame of when life began to form here on Earth, there were an uncountable number of chemical reactions going on. And so with that kind of large set and a large set over a long time period, it is 100% going to happen more than once. Have you ever heard of pigeonhole theory?
Yeah, you brought it up when we had our chat live, right. And but I actually disagree with you, John, and that comes to the let's suppose even that would be correct, what you're saying, that the odds of 10 to the 700,000 would not be 0, and it would be possible. But the problem lies much deeper than that. And the point which I told you before is the problem that molecules, they do not complexify, they disintegrate, and that is evidence-based. In the peer-reviewed paper from Steve Painter in 2012, Paradoxes in the Origin of Life, he writes, the asphalt paradox, an enormous amount of empirical data have established as a rule that organic systems, given energy and left to themselves, devolve to give useless complex mixtures, asphalts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, how do you explain the Miller-Uray experiment then?
Okay, the Miller-Uray experiment is often cited as a successful experiment which demonstrates that the making of prebiotic amino acids on a prebiotic Earth was feasible. The problem here is, first of all, they did not make only left-handed amino acids, they made racemic mixtures, and life uses 100%.
It doesn't matter.
It does matter. Life.
Well, I understand how it matters for life, but it doesn't matter for the purpose of the experiment and what the experiment actually showed. Because what the experiment actually showed was that these amino acids can definitely form naturally without any kind of intervention. And this proves the fact that chemicals reacting in this way will eventually produce these things. Now, for someone to claim that chemical reactions cannot produce more complex chemicals just simply is ignorant of all chemistry. Because, I mean, I don't have a lot of chemistry under my belt, but I do at least have inorganic and organic basics under my belt. And that is a basic fundamental thing that you learn in both inorganic and organic chemistry classes. The fact that you can cause like chemicals can come together and react and create more complex chemicals. That's just the laws of chemistry. So I mean, I don't know what you want to think of my thought process on this, but it just seems quite ridiculous to say that chemicals do not arrange themselves in more complex structures when that's exactly what we see in chemistry.
Okay, the Miller-Uray experiment, John, didn't produce all the amino acids which are used in life. For example,
but you understand that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many it did, or how many left-handed, right-handed, or middle-fingered amino acids it produced. All it did was show that they do develop naturally. So whatever kind of configuration that life utilizes amino acids now, the fact that they do form naturally is a big piece of evidence for abiogenesis happening.
Well, there are big problems here, John. First of all, there are hundreds of different amino acids extant on the prebiotic Earth, supposedly. They say about 500. But life uses only 20, in some cases 22 specific amino acids, and they have all to be left-handed. Now, there is no selection mechanism to sort out these specific amino acids which are used in life. And
that's wrong, because natural selection and other selection pressures would have caused that particular configuration to be the best configuration to survive in that environment. So, I mean, you just baselessly saying that there's no selection method does not equal evidence that there's no selection method.
Well, the problem, John, is that there was no life at this stage. There were just random molecules, and they were impure, and they were extant in every kind of form. I mean, amino acids do not come only in the configuration that is used in life. They come just with one-sided, they come two-sided, they come with side chains, they come without side chains, they come in all kinds of forms. They can interact in all kinds of forms. And that is actually a big problem. There was no selection process to bring up.
So sorry, let me interrupt you. So you're saying that with that on a prebiotic, you agree that on the prebiotic Earth, all of these amino acids would have been there, right?
No. The ones that are used in life would not have been there, because, as I was explaining previously, the Miller-Uray experiment did not produce all the 20 amino acids which are used in life. And amino acids, they are made through metabolic mechanisms in the cell. They are produced, they are fabricated in the cell. But for example, tryptophan, this is the most complex amino acid used in life. And there is no way that it would have occurred naturally. There is a very complex biosynthesis process to make that amino acid. And it has never been encountered naturally on Earth.
That's where you're losing me at, though, is when you make such a definitive statement to say that there's no way for that to occur naturally. I mean, you would, saying, what is it, Einsteinium? That doesn't occur naturally, because humans are the ones that made it, come into existence. For I can't remember what the half-life of like Einsteinium and some of these actual man-made elements are, but those things are things that won't come into existence naturally. I highly disagree with the idea that a perfectly normal like amino acid or the tryptophan that you're talking about. I highly disagree with the idea that chemicals can't react naturally and produce that particular amino acid. For one thing, when you're talking about living cells producing it, that is it happening naturally. That is it being naturally produced. So I think that you're kind of equivocating the situation of just a big pool of chemicals and tryptophan just naturally starting to form in a pool of chemicals. You're classifying that as being natural, whereas like cells producing tryptophan is still a natural process, and it is happening naturally in the natural world.
Yes, of course. But what we try to explain is how cells first arose. So, of course, that they are doing it now, that they are synthesizing tryptophan. That doesn't mean automatically that it originated naturally. What we try to explain is how life and cells first originated, and the process, the metabolic process to make tryptophan, as I said before, is not a simple process. It is extremely complex, and it requires many proteins which were actually not extant prebiotically to make tryptophan. So it is actually a catch-22 problem, because life uses proteins which are made by amino acids to make amino acids, including tryptophan, but tryptophan wasn't extant naturally on a prebiotic earth.
Okay. Well, in an effort to move the conversation forward, because I really only have about a half hour left that I can talk. Let's just. Is there any way that we can come to a mutual, I guess, agreement in the efforts of moving the conversation along? That let's say God snapped his fingers and the first cellular life started on the earth, right? That there's no reason to go into the whole abiogenesis thing, because I mean we have been stuck on this for a good half hour or more. So I mean, if we want to talk about abiogenesis later, we can. But let's just assume that God snapped his fingers and created the first single-celled life, and then just let it go, because then we're talking about like evolution and evolutionary mechanisms and everything like that. So could we go into that? I feel
no, we can go into that, John. I mean, I like to talk with you, and I think you are a nice guy to have an interaction. And of course, we can have other events eventually where we go in various topics, and if that is fine with you. And but yes, of course, we can switch again to evolution, no problem. I just wanted to show you this is one of the proteins which are required to make tryptophan. So that protein I cannot explain you now. We don't have enough time, but it is extremely complex, and that's what I am saying. You need complex machinery to make the amino acids which are used in life. So I mean, there is no evidence that these amino acids could have emerged prebiotically, and we have to go where the evidence leads. And we cannot say, oh, because it has not yet been found, that doesn't mean that it couldn't occur. Well, that is an unsupported claim. And what we can claim without evidence, we can discard without evidence. So there is no evidence that all the amino acids which are used in cells and in life were extant prebiotically.
Well, I mean, don't dole out Hitchens' razor against me, okay? Because I mean, I'm not the one that's making a baseless claim here. You're the one that's making the baseless claim that complexity can't arise naturally, and that's just simply not actually shown in the information. So, but like I said, I would really like to move on to actual evolution and evolutionary mechanisms.
Okay.
So what is because I mean I watched your video and I listened to it, but I'm wondering, can you point out like let's start with your best evidence against evolutionary biology.
Okay, there are two main points which I have pointed out previously, which are the points in dispute, which is common ancestry and the making of complex organisms and architecture of multicellular form. So we can address first common ancestry or the making of complex organisms. What would you like to talk about?
I mean, I feel like the making of complex organisms kind of goes back into the abiogenesis. So let's talk about common ancestry.
Okay. I will give you a list and point out why I think that common ancestry is not what the evidence points to. Okay.
Well, I mean, I understand that you have a list, but I'm wondering if maybe we can just go point by point.
Yes,
you know,
we can do that. I'll put it
Okay.
here on the screen, and then we can go over it. Okay, there are 9 main points. The first one, the DNA replication machinery is not homologous in the 3 domains of life. The bacterial core replisome enzymes do not share a common ancestor with the analogous components in eukaryotes and archaea. That's the first point.
Okay.
Do you want to go on?
I mean, I really don't see how this is actually disproving common descent. I guess I really don't even understand that first one.
Okay,
it not being homologous in the 3 domains of life. I don't even know if that's true. To be quite honest,
yes, it is true. I can show you the investigation, but
well, what makes me question it is the fact that this is a post that says that common descent is a failed hypothesis, which it's not, and then it's saying that DNA replication machinery is not homologous in the 3 domains of life. The 3 domains of life might have different machinery, but obviously it has some kind of DNA replication. Whether or not it's the exact same in every single tree, I don't think that really disproves anything. The fact that DNA does replicate in these trees is more than enough.
Well, the problem would be, John, that you have a machinery which is not. It is like, I give you an analogy, okay? It would be that you have a car made by Yamaha, by Honda, whatever, and then you have a car made by Rolls-Royce. And then your task would be, by evolutionary mechanisms, to transform that car made by Honda to the car made by Rolls-Royce, while the pieces and parts which are used in the Rolls-Royce are completely different than the pieces and parts made by Honda in their car. And of course, that is a transition which cannot happen because the structure is completely different. And that is what precisely we see as evidence here in the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. There are about 30 proteins required and used in DNA replication of prokaryotes. And these are irreducible. If you remove just one of these proteins, like helicase, you do not have any replication. And for example, in our cells, we require up to 600 different proteins, which are different than the proteins used in bacteria. So in order to say that there is a common ancestor, that we share a common ancestor, there should have to be some homology, and that is just not evidenced.
So you literally said that you can't make small changes to the design of a car and change it into a different car.
Yes, if you have a completely different setup for Rolls-Royce with different parts, then of course you cannot simply say, oh, we will use small things to come to that Rolls-Royce. It's the same to transform a bicycle into a motorcycle. I mean, the motorcycle has different parts, has a tank, has an engine, and so forth, which a bicycle doesn't have. And that's the same in regards of prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, because eukaryotic cells have many parts which prokaryotes do not have, like organelles, like the nucleus, like the nucleolus.
Well, yeah, but
like,
we've been able to postulate a very likely hypothesis for how eukaryotic cells formed. It's on the Berkeley Evolution website that I can give to you later. Basically, what they found in lab experiments was that a smaller bacteria invaded, their cultures, and the bacteria killed some of the other single-celled organisms there, some of the other bacteria, but then they noticed that sometimes the bacteria would be integrated into the cells, into the other prokaryotic single-celled organism. They would be integrated in there because they formed this symbiotic relationship. And what they found that when they killed when they introduced stuff to kill the bacteria that invaded, the host cell would also die, because now that particular cell is dependent upon that other smaller cell. And this is compared to how eukaryotic cells first formed, because we have the mitochondria, who have the mitochondria DNA and everything like that. They look like very simple, like cellular organisms that are living inside these larger organisms. And so that's how it would have, that's the most likely method for how eukaryotic cells formed, is that they formed these symbiotic relationships with these other single-celled organisms, and they started living together, and once they actually reproduced, it became part of the DNA to produce that. So we have scientific explanations for the progression from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells.
Okay, there are several problems here, John. First of all,
okay.
The mitochondria has a genome of about 20,000 nucleotides, while the smallest free-living bacteria, which I pointed out previously, has 1.3 million nucleotides. So you would require an extreme reduction of the genome from 1.3 million nucleotides to 20,000 nucleotides. That's just one problem. The second one is that the universal genetic code is different than the mitochondrial code in mitochondria. So to have a transition from a universal genetic code to mitochondrial code, that would require an entire change of the system and the translation system. You would not have just to change the genetic code. You would also have to change all the machinery which makes the translation. That is the set of tRNAs, the set of amino acid tRNA synthetases. You would have basically to change the whole thing. And this is simply not feasible.
It's not feasible? How do you know that it's not feasible? Obviously when eukaryotic life started to form, that was the most survivable life form. Like the integration of different smaller prokaryotic living organisms into this larger prokaryotic organism in order for them to survive better in the environment is perfectly predicted on evolutionary theory. And to say that that prokaryotic life has to produce amino acids and has to do all these things in the exact same ways as or at least maybe not that specific, maybe just in general function the same way as a eukaryotic cell, which would definitely function differently, is just ridiculous. Obviously, eukaryotic cells are going to function differently than prokaryotic cells.
Well, the problem is you require the change from a prokaryotic cell to a eukaryotic cell, which has a diameter 1,000 times bigger. And that, of course, brings an energy problem. How do you supply the energy to sustain that sized cell? And secondly, it has
I don't understand the energy problem that you're talking about.
Well, to have a cell with a dimension of 1,000 times the diameter of a prokaryotic cell and a volume of 15,000 times of a prokaryotic cell, that is a huge difference, which causes an energy problem. And of course, they try to say, oh, okay, the prokaryote engulfed another primordial cell, which then somehow these organelles, these mitochondria started to replicate and so forth. But it is not so easy as they explain. And I can send you a link afterwards. You can have a look of it. There are many parts which are synthesized externally to the mitochondria, which then have to be imported into mitochondria. That is another huge problem because you need the membrane proteins which do that import of the parts into mitochondria and so forth. So there are huge problems, conceptual problems, which don't make this hypothesis so feasible and easy.
No, see, I disagree with this because it just seems like you're saying, oh, this is unlikely to happen, therefore it doesn't happen.
Well, this is the whole point. What science does, John, is try to see where the evidence leads. And when something is not likely, then you have to find out what is more likely. And the likeliness of the endosymbiotic theory is simply, it is not feasible because there are conceptual problems.
Well, then explain the actual experiment that has been done that has shown a prokaryotic cell absorbing another, like a bacteria, and integrating it directly into its into its function. Okay, how do you explain that happening now? Why does it happen now, but it would not happen in the past?
Okay, I would have to see the paper. If you want to provide it to me afterwards, I can have a look and then see what they actually did and if it relates to the endosymbiotic theory.
Well, yeah. So, but I mean, it does. I mean, it's basically what I said. There's a bacteria that get introduced to a culture. The bacteria killed off some of the cells. Some of the other cells integrated the bacteria into their into their living cell, into their cell. And then when scientists tried to kill the bacteria, the larger cell would also die because now they're in a symbiotic relationship. So, I mean, that particular group of single-celled organisms was fundamentally changed by the bacteria in that it's now a symbiotic relationship where it's a lot like saying you need your stomach in order to survive. You know, well, I mean, technically you can have your stomach, cut out and there's ways that you can survive. But I'm just talking about, like, if I ripped your stomach out right now, you probably wouldn't survive that, right? I mean, it's the exact same situation with this particular thing. If you rip that bacteria out of that organism is going to die because it needs that bacteria for its continued survival. So, I mean, it just doesn't make a lot of sense for these things to happen now, for them to be able to occur in the lab setting, and then, but that's like the only time that it's ever happened, and there's no way that it could happen in the past. Like, it seems like if the bacteria naturally got integrated into the cell's structure, without like creating Einsteinium, like an Einsteinium level of creation from the scientists, it seems like it would have happened naturally in the past as well. Unless, I guess you go from you're starting off from the idea that things fundamentally worked different prior to, I guess, either the flood or Eden falling, or the fall of man. Is that your hypothesis? Is that just everything, like physics, chemistry, everything just operated completely differently prior to the fall of man?
Well, we are moving goalposts now, John. I would like just to respond to what you said, that you think that experiment which you mentioned proves that the endosymbiotic hypothesis is possibly correct. And as I said, I didn't read that paper, but if you want to provide it to me after we talk, I can have a look at it. And then I can tell you if it is related to the hypothesis, and if that would be evidence that the endosymbiotic theory or hypothesis is compelling and evidence-based. So before I don't have a look at that paper, I cannot tell you, okay, you have a point. Now, in regards of the flood and pre-Adam, I mean, what God said when He created Adam and Eve and the whole thing, He said that it was very good. And when the fall happened, that it was corrupted. And that's when entropy started and everything started to wind down and be as we know it to be today.
Okay. So my question specifically was, do you think that all of physics and chemistry operated differently prior to the fall of man?
Well, I think that it operated in a probably thermodynamically in a better fashion. But of course, I don't know the details to tell you exactly what that was and how it was and so forth, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically what you presented here is that is that it would have to fundamentally work, like chemistry and physics would fundamentally have to be different in order for what you're positing.
That's not what I'm saying.
I'm saying that this is what your particular position entails.
No, I don't think so. I think that I as I said, I cannot give you the details how it was then, but God said it was very good what He created. And when the fall happened, then it became corrupted. Now, how this corruption took place, in what precise manner, and what it entailed, and what was before, and how it became afterwards, I didn't think about this, and I cannot give you a precise answer to your question.
Okay. What is your primary, because I've only got about 15 minutes left before I've got to go.
Yeah, okay.
What's your primary evidence against natural selection being able to shape organisms?
Well, I can give you a prime example, John.
Okay.
Photosynthesis is basic for all advanced life forms even to exist. Okay. And photosynthesis is one of the most complex biosynthesis processes known in life. And it is performed by cyanobacteria, which are claimed to be one of the first life forms extant on Earth. It goes back about 2.5 to 3 billion years in geological time. So cyanobacteria, they did photosynthesis. Now, the interesting thing is that the production of oxygen depends on the oxygen evolving complex in the photosynthesis process. Okay, and this is a process which requires a metal reaction center, which is based on some metals like molybdenum, and 5 proteins which surround that reaction center. And there the reaction of splitting water takes place. Now, they have done knockout experiments, and they did see that each of those 5 proteins, they are absolutely essential and required in order to have the reaction. If they knocked out any of those 5 proteins, then the reaction didn't occur. Now, these proteins by themselves, they do not have any function. They only function in a joint venture in that reaction. So, of course, that raises the question, why would evolution produce a protein which by itself, without the other proteins working in a joint venture, would have no function at all? Because the claim is that it is step by step, and each step provided some more survival benefit. But that protein by itself has no survival use at all. It only works in the joint venture with all the 5 proteins together with the reaction center at that metal atoms in the center, which is providing a functional whole, which then is able to perform the water splitting and the production of oxygen. So this is actually an evolution killer, because there are no intermediate stages from non-oxygenic photosynthesis to oxygenic photosynthesis. And this is acknowledged by scientists which work in the field. And this is a big problem.
No, I mean, I don't think that it's a big problem, because essentially what your position boils down to is that it's unlikely that it would have developed naturally. So therefore, it probably didn't develop naturally. But I totally disagree with that sentiment. Just because something is unlikely to happen doesn't mean that it won't happen. It just means that it won't happen often. And once photosynthesis started to develop in organisms, then it would have continued to develop in organisms, and it would have become the norm. In primarily plants, and plant like single-celled organisms that use photosynthesis. So I mean, you have to understand that, or at least I feel like you don't understand the fact that just because something's unlikely doesn't mean that it's not going to happen.
Well, the thing is, John, we need to go where the evidence leads. And when something seems unlikely in one way, then it is reasonable and feasible that we look if there are other possible mechanisms which explain the defeat in questions in a better and more adequate manner.
Yeah, Otangelo, but God did it is not an explanation.
Why not?
God, because it doesn't explain anything. It's just it's a placeholder explanation.
No, it explains everything. If you see a
okay. Let me ask you this. Shifting to a different topic a little bit here. How does God did it explain lightning?
Okay. You don't need an explanation of the explanation, John. I'm not sure, but I think I explained you that in our other chat when I said, when we have an adequate explanation to a phenomenon, then we do not have and require an explanation of the explanation, because then that would require again an explanation of the explanation, and then you have an eternal regress.
I'm sorry, but you understand that that's the exact position that people had for like simple things like lightning. Like at the time, people thought that God, like even Christians, felt that God like threw lightning bolts, right? Or caused lightning to happen. In fact, I believe it was Benjamin Franklin, maybe, that invented the lightning rod. The lightning rod.
Yeah, I don't know. Of course,
but so with the invention of the lightning rod, Christians were mad at him because they felt like he was intervening in God's will, because people that would ring, the church bells would be struck by lightning and killed, and they felt like that was a decision by God to kill that person. Like that person deserved to die for whatever reason because God said so. So, I mean, it just, saying that God did it has always been questioned in history. And as soon as we find a natural explanation, the God did it explanation becomes obsolete. We don't think that God does anything else. It's just these very small gaps that God lives in now, at least for you, because for you, I feel like you assume that just because something's unlikely to happen, it won't happen. And I get that you think that if something's unlikely to happen, then you have to have a better explanation for how it could have happened. I get that, but you're also neglecting the sample set. Like, how big is the sample size of chemical reactions and development of organisms? Like, how big of a set is that? I mean, there's been an uncountable amount of living organisms on this planet so far, including the single-celled organisms. To suggest that unlikely in this situation means that it won't happen, or it most likely, like it's like that's a worst explanation, is simply just not founded using basic statistical probability.
Well, I think that in epistemology, John, you need to go where the evidence leads. And it has been shown over and over that intelligence can produce blueprints, can produce languages, can produce information transmission systems, can use all this to instruct the making of machines and factories. And we know by our own experience that intelligence is capable of producing all these things.
Okay.
Now,
So you using what you just said right there, that we need to go where the evidence leads us.
yes,
Right
absolutely.
now, all of the evidence leads us to the fact that there's a natural explanation for the biodiversity of life. There has not been one single God did it in the past that has not been overcome by a natural explanation for things. There's not been one thing in the past that has been better explained by God did it. It's always been superseded by a natural explanation. So it would seem to me that the evidence is leading us to a natural explanation and not a supernatural one.
Well, the core issue here is, Sean, where does information originate? Does it originate by random events or by intelligence?
I think that you would need to define what you're talking about with information, because like I could talk about how there's a tree, outside my apartment that communicates a lot of information to me. It's green, it's tall, it's got branches, the branches are brown. Like, it just depends on how you define what information is.
Okay.
But even then, if you notice in that particular example, it's me talking about what I experience when I look at a tree, and I am interpreting the information, interpreting it as information. I don't think the tree inherently has information. It definitely takes a mind to interpret things as information.
Okay, you need to make an important distinction here, John. One is descriptive information, which you gave a nice example right now, where you see a tree and then you describe it, and that is information. But the other kind of information is prescriptive information, where you actually instruct how to make things. And I, as a machine designer, I sit on the drawing table and I will draw a machine and I will instruct how in the factory that machine has to be made. I will give the precise sizes and what the materials are that have to be employed, the form of that machine, the everything which has to be defined in order for the factory workers to take that plan and that blueprint and then read it, and then upon that information they will make the device in 3D form in real life. And this is the kind of information that the prescriptive information, which is precisely contained in the genome, which instructs the making of proteins and the organelles and the parts in the cell and the diversification of the cells and so forth. And that is the kind of information that has to be explained where it came from. And we know only of intelligence being able to make blueprints, put a piece of ink on the table and then a piece of paper, and then I will tell you, John, write now the information Peter loves Sally. And just by throwing ink on the paper a trillion times, and to see if then you will have the instruction written on that paper.
But that's not an applicable comparison there to evolution and evolutionary theory. Now, this is going to be the final question I ask, because I do got to go.
Yeah, sure. No problem.
But do you, whenever you make your machines, do you ever make them to do something that they're not supposed to do?
Well, I make them robust. That means every machine has its time of usage. And of course, I will try to make it robust in the sense that it will have as much life to do its operation as possible. But at one point, it will break. We know that machines, they have no, they have guarantee of 2 years or 5 years. And then we know that they have a life cycle or a usage cycle, and at one point they will break and they cannot be used anymore because of entropy.
Right. But if you were a perfect designer, right? If you were perfect, why would you design something to randomly change?
Well, as I said, John, the fact that God is perfect doesn't mean that his creation had to be perfectly created, which is also you would have to define what is meant by perfect. But he said when he created in Genesis the world, he said it was very good. Very good doesn't mean perfect. So
yeah, but I would expect a perfect designer to design something perfectly. I mean, if I have a certain quality about me, like if I'm a perfect programmer, then there should be no I should have the most robust and proficient code out there.
Well, I mean, if you check, for example, the cell has an error rate of 1 error in 10 billion nucleotides. And this is due to the error check and repair mechanisms, which are also life essential. They had to emerge prior when life began. Otherwise, the mutation rate would be so high that the cell would immediately make non-functional proteins and it would die. So this is highest technology there, John. And we don't come even close to do that.
Well, I mean, I disagree, but maybe we can get together some other time and talk about it a little bit more.
Sure.
So I really appreciate your time today there, Otangelo, and I will set up another time to discuss, because this has been fun. I've really liked this discussion.
Okay.
So I'm sorry I'm having to cut it off a little short today.
Sure. Let me just end the broadcast.